Hello, I'll do another video, very quick one. I thought it appropriate to do a kind of I told you so clip, if you like, on the shortcomings of society, or what is actually happening now, which is going to affect your future, everyone's future, irrespective of if you're intrigued by this kind of topics or not. So, as I've already stated before, and as many people have stated, as well as just myself, of course, I'm not taking credit for this, but many years ago, on video, and all of these admittances or facts are shown in our podcast. Before COVID, we stated that there was going to be a artificial biological outbreak as a mechanism by which to cede control to kind of more authoritarian entities, and to essentially measure how subservient society is to any kind of ludicrous attack of the unknown. The genius of the system that they implant is that they have absolute control, absolute pure authority over 100% of people pretty much on this planet, and consequently they can impose any kind of warfare they see fit, whether it's direct warfare, whether it's a form of direct warfare through biological kind of, in this instance COVID-19, which is a total scam, or the coming biological warfares which we see through environmental catastrophe, which can also be implemented and has been implemented for quite some time, albeit most likely on a lesser scale. But should they wish to impose things like flooding or hurricanes, etc., the technology is very capable of doing so. I mean, one very public example of such is in the Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, etc., where you can actually artificially inseminate rain upon any given city or environment. And this is something that 20-30 years ago people would look at as a kind of a miracle imposed by God, or some kind of fantastic trick of the eye. But no, it's very plausible and very feasible to do, remembering of course that all technological output that you see in the public sector is probably 50, 60, 70 years behind what military grade hardware has installed. But that's not really my point. My point is we're seeing a kind of a triple front in terms of conflict that's no different to the First World War or the Second World War. We have the China-Taiwan front, we have the Ukraine-Russia front, and we have the Israel-Gaza front, which would be the epicenter of a very large-scale international conflict. And again, I try to emphasize, people look at the history books and they think that somehow society changes because they themselves are perhaps carrying an iPhone, or they're wearing Nike trainers, or they have a car. But in reality, nothing changes. The formula of the human mind remains the same, and the structure imposed upon the mass man by those that govern always retains the same systematic formula. Whether it's the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the feudal wars, the Wars of the Roses in Middle England, or the US War of Independence, the Civil War, First World War, Second World War, Vietnam conflict, Gulf War, you name it, there's always a war. They always impose it, it's always artificially inseminated, and this will be the biggest war the world has ever seen. And they've been building up for it for a very long time, as they always do. If you look back on the Second World War, of course, the largest conflict between 1945 and today, it was a 10-year process of proxy wars and building up with small-scale civil conflicts until finally it reached that cataclysm and millions of people lost their lives. And the exact same thing is happening now. So we've seen in the mass media the propaganda with respect to Japan moving in vessels towards Taiwan, warships. We've seen China open up its visa policy, remembering, as I said at the beginning, that the war isn't always the visible, atypical conflict where people are killing one another. One of the major characteristics of the modern conflict is the movement and displacement of peoples. When you displace a large proportion of people, you have to put them somewhere. And of course, you naturally place them in a position which undermines an existing population, also known as mass migration. So in Europe now, if you go to Germany, the vast majority of people that you'll see in city-states like Frankfurt, where the population is now 52 to 53% non-German born people, or Birmingham, where the majority of people are non-Caucasian, non-British born citizens, you see absolute anarchy. You see criminality like never seen before. Malmö in Sweden is now the violent capital of not just Europe, but its crime levels are comparable with countries in Africa like Lesotho. It's actually the crime capital with respect to firearms in the whole of Europe, which is incredible when you think about Sweden being a country branded as very kind of progressive and liberal, as it so was in the 80s when they started accepting mass migration. And all of this is essentially a pincer movement. It's a mechanism by which to restrict any domestic opposition, remembering, of course, that Europe and the Western world, with respect to the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia primarily, in the last century or so have been places with the most, you could say privilege, but I don't want to use that word, most economic advancements that allow people to lead a perhaps more prosperous life than anywhere else in the world. But with that comes opposition. A corrupt government finds it very difficult to implement any kind of illogical policy if the population has a general gist of what's happening, a general understanding and an educational background that enables them to critically analyze what's happening in any kind of current affair scenario. So by the laws of logic, just like with a cuisine, with food, if you go to a kitchen and you dilute a good dish with something which is fundamentally opposed, an ingredient which restricts the flavor or opposes the flavor to make something rather unsavory, you have a situation where people no longer have the time and the capacity to think outside the box and challenge these corrupt entities, because they're too busy bickering amongst themselves over essentially the aggravation they're seeing on the street between different religious ideologies, different political ideologies, and at the aesthetic value, of course, different kind of pigmentations through different racial categorizations, different racial profiles, I should say. So at the same time, we've just seen Portugal now has basically got an open door policy, which the European Union has always had. Germany stated that they accepted 800,000 refugee applications in 1 year, which is actually impossible when you think about how many people are employed in that governmental department. It is not even possible to analyse a tenth of those applications. To fast track 800,000 people is just an open door policy of allowing 800,000 people into the country. And we're seeing the same with the United States. The Mexican border is completely open, crime is through the roof. Of course, the propaganda mechanism is still at play, and people still fundamentally believe that if you go to most places in the world, you're in danger. You go to Central Africa, you're going to be robbed, raped and pillaged. Well, the violent crime capital of the world is the United States. Every day there's a mass shooting, every day there's millions of people that are in abject poverty. 1 in 3 people are on prescription drugs, permanently I should say. The main drug, of course, being an opioid, which is a heroin-based supplement, for lack of a better term, provided by these pharmaceutical companies, who are of course drug dealers. There's no difference whatsoever. The biggest drug dealers, of course, being the Sassoon family, going back to 1860s China, which was a British aristocratic family and the largest corporate entity at that time, followed closely by the Rothschilds, who now run the Vanguard hedge fund, which owns and operates nearly every corporate entity in the world, from Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola. Every pharmaceutical company like Moderna or Pfizer is all operated by one hedge fund. They own over 95% of companies in the world. Again, something people don't understand. Again, we predicted in our video, which is off of the back of the imposing of biometric systems 5 or so years ago, again from the United States, but it's branched out to Europe, whereby credit cards, debit cards, cash for many years are no longer accepted in supermarkets. Instead, you have to download an application in order to enter a supermarket where you're not actually allowed to pay for your products. Instead, it's automatically detracted from your account because every item in your basket is scanned. Well, as predicted, as of a few weeks ago in the United Kingdom, the first biometric eye scanners have been implanted in refrigerators and supermarkets. So if you want to open a door in a supermarket to take out milk or any refrigerated product, you have to have your eye scanned. And of course they say, which is ludicrous anyway, of course, it's to do with shoplifting and it's to safeguard the supermarket's vulnerability to criminal activity. Well, I can tell you, criminals are not stealing yogurt and milk, are they? This is all about data harvesting and remembering that the most valuable commodity today is not gold, it's not platinum, it's not silver, it's not wheat, it's not lumber. It is the analytics, it's your data. The more a corporation understands how you as a consumer operate, what you buy, what your routine is from day to day, they can develop a perfect mind map of what's to come tomorrow. And if you can predict the future, by God, you are literally God yourself. And that's what they aspire to be. So what we're seeing is, as I said, this front of mass migration globally. We're seeing a triple conflict. And off the back of this conflict, they're going to impose the new agenda. And the new agenda is a digital currency format, not dissimilar to the Chinese social credit system, which will enable the government to essentially disallow certain purchases, which has already been advanced through the government in the United Kingdom. The Bank of England has already stated that they want to create a form of cryptocurrency which enables them to block certain transactions. And again, transaction blocking is something that we've seen happen in Canada with respect to political opposition. They have had their bank accounts frozen, notably the truckers during their protests, which is of course all illegal, but law doesn't stand for anything anymore. It's all fugazi, it's all a farce. So the only way to impose this on a macro level very, very rapidly is through a cyber attack. And again, as predicted, the last weeks, the last months, the last years, they're constantly talking about a cyber attack happening, and indeed cyber attacks have happened. Of course, they blame it on the Chinese or the Russians because this is this artificial sentiment that's been in place for, decades, if not centuries, where you always have to have an enemy figure in one's life to create social divide and to create a lack of social cohesion. So to implement this macro, we're going to see a cyber attack, probably in the Western world. And off of the back of that, everyone will lose their savings, everyone will lose their pensions, and it being a digital currency system primarily in the West where people don't have cash, you'll have to rely on the government for your welfare. Your rent will have to be paid by the government, your shopping will have to be paid by the government, and this enables the government to pick and choose whom they give privilege to, who they give authority to. So it's essentially a reward-based system whereby if you don't adhere to the principles of the government, they won't give you the money to pay your rent, remembering that you just lost that all through this super cyber attack, which they themselves, of course, implemented as a mechanism to reset the financial system. And that's what's going to happen. And again, we predicted this years and years ago, and live feed, everything we've said is already happening. And the conflict is most likely going to be around 2030 because they've stated it themselves. They have a published 2030 agenda for so-called modernization in the European Union. And again, symbolically speaking, 2030 is a numerologically important number. So they implement all of these things utilizing gematria to represent their occultist value set. So that's what we're going to see happening. And I just thought I'd post that for future reference.